The truth is that many of us have never given our own safety a significant thought when it came to running. We run during the day and in well-populated areas, doing enough to feel safe. But as more and more women are murdered while running, the grim truth that the next one could be one of us stares back at us in the mirror. And we have to face the facts. We are not safe while doing something we love. The thing that brings us joy, confidence, and a sense of worth could be the very thing that gets us murdered or missing. I'm going to tell you these stories because every runner matters. Every single woman who laced up her shoes and didn't come back alive deserves to have her story told. And to every woman still heading out the door, taking extra precautions to try to ensure she comes home, I see you. I am you. This is Girl Gone Running, a Tragedy with a View series about murdered and missing runners. I am your host, Kayla. Welcome back. Okay, welcome back. This is the last Girl Gone Running episode of the season, and this is a loaded one. And for that reason, I was going to have this be an exclusive only episode, but I think this one would be better just being out there. And I promise for those of you who are subscribers and you were expecting to get an extra episode, I will get you a bonus episode this summer at some point. Also, on that note, this particular episode is violent in nature, so please listen with care. And as your general reminder, in June, we are going to be having a merch launch. Again, 100% of the proceeds are either going to the National Park Foundation, National Forest Foundation, or at the end of the year, if you don't buy like that specific merch, everything else at the end of the year goes to a nonprofit of your choosing, which you'll want to join us either on Patreon or Instagram or Facebook, where I will be asking for nonprofits that you would like to support and then providing a poll for you to vote on those. So just keep that in mind as we get through this year, that every single dollar that you invest, every single share, every single review, every single time you talk about this podcast, every comment, every like on social media, all of those go and do good and do better. And 100% of the proceeds goes to nonprofits. I pay myself exactly $0 from this podcast. And so that just feels really good to me. And I really thank you so much for allowing me to have the opportunity to do some good in this world. And moving on from that, for those of you who do not know the history of Kaye Turner, we are going to get into this one. And like I said, this is a loaded episode, so buckle up. We are going for a ride down Highway 20. Highway 20 is a roadway that winds through the thick forests and rugged mountain terrain from Sisters, Oregon to Lebanon, Oregon. The highway is 87 miles long, or 140 kilometers, and if you were to drive this entire length, it would take you somewhere around 2 hours. There are several parks and campgrounds and lakes that this highway allows you access to, and while there are small towns dotted along the way, the majority of the road is pretty remote. One of these campgrounds is Camp Sherman. Camp Sherman is technically an unincorporated community that is located along the Methulis River, and while not directly on Highway 20, it is just north of the highway. Historically, the area was founded when wheat farmers in the area were looking for a way to cool down from the blaring summer heat and found it along the Methulis River, and then nailed a sign to a tree, dubbing the location Camp Sherman. In 1915, a small convenience store, which is known as the Camp Sherman store, was opened, and they have operated since. And this store sits about 5 miles north of Highway 20. Here at Camp Sherman, visitors can find the clear and cold Methulis River, the Wizard Falls Fish Hatchery, trails for hiking and running, the campground for those wanting to sleep in tents, along with lodges for those who want to sleep in beds, and a community hall for social activities. Surrounding the area is the Deschutes National Forest, which is filled with wildlife like deer, coyotes, and cougar. And on Christmas Eve of 1978, Kaye Turner, her husband Noel, and a few friends were enjoying this time together at Camp Sherman. Kaye was 35 years old and was a very active runner, which is mostly unusual for women, especially at this time. Now, something we have not touched on yet in this series is the history of women's running. For a long time, men, both professionally and not, believed that women were just too fragile to run. They believed our uteruses would fall out if we ran too far. But running in the 70s was a transformative period for women. The decade marked the first major running boom, with the recreational running gaining popularity, but still women faced significant barriers as they were only allowed to register for marathons starting in 1972. The first woman to run the Boston Marathon was Bobby Gill in 1966. However, she ran it unofficially because women were not allowed to officially register for the race at that time. Bobby had to hide in bushes near the starting line and then joined the race after it began, and she completed the marathon ahead of many of the men she was running against. And then the first woman to officially register and run the Boston Marathon was Kathrine Switzer in 1967, and she entered the race using the initials KV Switzer to avoid detection. During the race, an official tried to physically remove her, but she persisted and finished the marathon. And I believe that there were actually men who were running around her and running in the race who helped block the official from being able to get her. There's a really popular photo out there of this. And also, I would like to note, for those of you who are runners, you know that the Boston Marathon is occurring on Monday. So if you're listening to this on release day, I hope that anyone who is in the area has the best time. If you are running Boston now or at a later date, I hope you have the best race you've ever run and have so much fun. And also, because my little runner's heart would be really happy, let me know. I want to know how you did. I want to cheer you on. That would be so cool. We're going to go back to the story now. So again, the 70s was really this transformative period for women, and the introduction of the first sports bra in 1977 was a real big game changer for women as athletes because it provided much needed support and comfort. And the first prototype was actually 2 jock straps sewn together. And as many women know, the proper supports can mean the world of difference between having a really good and solid run versus just being really distracted and really uncomfortable. And being uncomfortable can throw everything off. So this was really, really great to have. But again, in the 70s, despite these advancements, women still had to overcome societal misconceptions about their physical capabilities. And this period of time laid the foundation for growth of women participating in running and competitive sports. And Kaye was making her own mark in the running community. At this point, she had already run a marathon, and on Christmas Eve, Kaye was planning to go for a run with one of her friends who was camping with her. But her friend was kind of new to running and just not very confident and decided not to go. So Kaye set out alone for an 8-mile run, which she anticipated was going to take her about an hour to get through. And if you are not familiar with running 8 miles in 1 hour is a very fast run. She had on her bright yellow running shorts, a white shirt, and running shoes. But when she hadn't returned for about 2 hours, Noel and her friends began to get worried, and they started to look for her. At first, they thought that maybe she got lost or maybe potentially ran away. But as they continued to find and hear nothing, their worries grew and grew. Finally, when the police were called and arrived to Camp Sherman and they began to interview those who were there, this was when two boys mentioned they saw a construction worker talking to her. This construction worker was identified as Jon Arthur Ackroyd. Jon stated that he did, in fact, see her running down Highway 20, but he didn't stop and he didn't talk to her. He was in the area because he had gotten off of work at about 6:45 a.m. and was heading to his friend's Roger Beck's, so that way he could go deer hunting with him because Roger had fallen on hard times and was in need of a deer to provide food for his family to eat. Jon went to Camp Sherman to look for deer to poach when he saw Kaye running. As he was driving around, he noticed that he was really low on fuel, and he headed about 10 miles away to the closest gas station, filled his tank back up, and as he started to head in the direction from which he came, he passed Kaye again. He was likely among the last to see her alive. Once back at Camp Sherman area, he was able to track down a deer, which he successfully shot, gutted, and cleaned for Roger. But this information didn't help locate Kaye. All the police knew now was that she was running along Highway 20, and as they searched, they found something. Just off Highway 20 was a small, muddy trail. This trail appeared to have fresh tracks from running shoes small enough to be that of a woman's, and intermingled with those prints were the large tracks from men's boots. Along the way, the tracks seemed to indicate a struggle, with them winding back and forth and seeming to stumble off the trail before returning back onto the trail. But when police reached the end of the trail of prints, nothing more was found. Looking a little into Kaye's personal life, because of course, when a woman goes missing under suspicious circumstances, her husband is usually the first to be suspected. Investigators, so again, they looked into Kaye's personal life, and they found pretty easily that Kaye had been having an affair. Now, hear me out. We listen and we don't judge. They found out that Kaye had been having an affair with not one, but two different married men. With this information, investigators were convinced that Noel was to blame. He must have found out about the affair or affairs and got angry and attacked Kaye, killing her somewhere deep in the forest and then walking out like nothing happened. But upon questioning, it became very clear that Noel had no idea that Kaye had been having an affair, let alone two. So then they looked at these two men and their wives as well as potential suspects. And as those leads came to a halt, the case of what happened to Kaye was left with a gaping hole. It wasn't until 8 months later, in August of 1979, that they got a break in the case. And this was when a man walked into the Camp Sherman store and essentially said that he found a body in the woods. When police arrived, they got more information that the body was actually just some scattered bones and yellow running shorts. The man had been out in the woods hunting deer with his dog, and when he spoke to the police, he told them something alarming, or some things that were alarming. Before going to the body, the man had made a comment to the police that the body smelled really bad, and this is essentially how he found it, or maybe how his dog found it and led him to this area. But once arriving on scene, police found that there wasn't any flesh left, and the scene did not smell like decomposition at all. There was nothing left to make that smell. All that was found was some hair in a bird's nest and a lower jawbone. And then this man guessed that this was probably Kaye, that missing runner. And yeah, that made sense because he had seen her in February laying on top of the snow. Back in February, her eyes had been gone, her throat had been cut, it looked like animals had been in the area, and there was a hole in her chest that looked to be the exit wound for a gunshot. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, this man was Jon Ackroyd. Upon hearing this, the police immediately started to suspect Jon, but he refused to repeat these statements to anyone else and asked for a lawyer. And those tracks that investigators found during their initial search that implied a man and a woman had been struggling, they were heading to the same location where Kaye's remains were found. Though this was confirmed to be Kaye, and the police had strong suspicions that Jon was to blame for her disappearance and her death, they had no evidence. And if they tried to go to court now, they knew they would be fighting a losing battle. And with that, Kaye's case went cold. Now, it makes sense that Jon would be in this area because he worked as a highway maintenance person who spent his days helping to clean up wrecks, clear stuck cars, help stranded drivers, and repair equipment in construction zones. Others mentioned that he often blamed women for the world's problems and stated that they were the cause of all of the world's wars. But he kind of had this violent nature from a young age. Growing up, his family had bred their black lab, and when they posted a news ad about the puppies being for sale, a friend of Jon's decided that he wanted to go over and play with the puppies. When he arrived, I'm going to give you a content warning here. When he arrived, he found the puppies' bodies had been torn apart and scattered all over the front yard. Jon, without emotion, simply said that they were his, and if he couldn't have them, no one could. Despite this aggressive behavior, most of the time he just seemed like an average person. Many liked or at least put up with him, and sometimes he would make comments that made others uncomfortable, but for the most part, he was seen as a stable person with a good job, and in addition to that, he'd never been arrested. He didn't really have a record. And while Jon had this background, he hid it very well. Well enough that in the 1980s, Jon married Linda, a single mom with a 14-year-old son, Byron, and a 13-year-old daughter, Rashonda. They moved in with him at the Sandham Junction, and while things appeared to be well on the outside, both Byron and Rashonda would often go to school with black eyes and bruising. Rashonda even once came to school with chunks of her hair missing, where Jon had ripped it out when he got mad. Linda, while Jon was good to her and seemed to be a really good source of stability for her family, kind of turned a blind eye to these injuries and this behavior because, from my understanding, she was kind of scared to go back to being a single mom and struggling to get food on the table for her children. And in addition to the stuff that was happening behind closed doors to Rashonda, she had friends in school who were being sexually assaulted by their own family members. And so she didn't really have a healthy outlet or a place to go where she was safe. But this was really only the beginning, and this is partially the reason that in the summer of 1990, Byron and Rashonda begged their mom to let them go live with their biological father for the summer, and she reluctantly agreed. But things were tense under his roof as well. Their father insisted that he knew Rashonda had been sexually assaulted by a prior boyfriend of their mother's, and he was angry about this. And quite honestly, I would be too. He was so angry, in fact, that he was threatening to take them away from their mother, but this seemed to be all threats at the time. And when Rashonda got mad and left to return home, he didn't stop her. But she didn't really go home. Not really. She began to stay at her friends' homes because she did not want to be home alone with Jon. And when she was forced to return home, she would throw fits and kind of like toddler temper tantrums and hide in her friends' homes. But this wasn't always the case. Sometimes she was forced to go to her own home. And it was after this that Rashonda began to mention to her friends that what was happening to them behind closed doors was happening to her too, implying that Jon was sexually assaulting her. Jon learned about Byron and Rashonda's dad trying to take custody of the kids, which by July he had actually began to act on. And shortly after, on July 10th, 1990, no one was able to reach Rashonda. On this day, Rashonda was supposed to be home alone between the time that her mom and Jon had left for work to the time that they would return home. But Jon did not work a full day and returned home early. Here, he asked Rashonda to come with him for a ride, and when she said no, he left and left her at home, or so he claims. According to him, he was going out to look for deer and wanted her to go with him. When she said no, he set off on his own. He drove through construction areas where coworkers saw him on his own. And when he got back home between noon and 1, Rashonda was gone. When Jon picked Linda up, he told her that Rashonda was not home. And as the night wore on, Linda began to get more and more worried. When they called Byron and their father to let them know, Byron wanted to call the police right away, but Jon said that you can't even call until it had been 24 hours. Finally, the next day, Linda calls the police to report Rashonda missing, and even the dispatcher questions the delay. All that Linda said was that she thought you had to wait for 24 hours, and this call ignites a fire. 100 searchers from 6 different counties started looking through the area for Rashonda. They looked from the air, they searched on foot, and there was nothing found to lead searchers to discovering that Rashonda had been there at all. With investigators already suspecting Jon due to Kaye's murder, they actually invited Jon on a search with them, hoping that he might inadvertently lead them to something, anything that they could use to find Rashonda. Like we already know with Kaye, Jon visited her at least twice before her body was found, or before Jon finally told someone that her body had been found. But in this circumstance, they were out of luck. The only slip he made was that, quote, maybe a log had been placed over top of her body. During this time, investigators created a special group who were focused solely on getting Jon in jail. They had determined at this point that he was a predator, and so they had, again, a special group who were solely focusing on him and watching him and piecing all of the things that they could together to get him behind bars. During this time, a pair of pants was actually found just shy of 2 weeks after Rashonda had gone missing. The deputy who found the pants showed a highway worker who was nearby, and when he saw them, his reaction was disturbing, to say the least. And while he didn't say much about them, his body language was telling. As he looked at the pants, the highway worker, who we can now say was Jon, appeared to get an erection, and near the zipper of his pants, a wet spot appeared. Later in an interview, Linda would admit that sometimes Jon would say things like, "I just want to kill somebody," and for their entire relationship, Jon was just not interested in sex, except for on one occasion. And that occasion happened to be the night that Rashonda went missing. And this is indicating because it tells us that something got him very excited. But with no body and no clues, while Jon was strongly suspected to be involved, this case also went cold. In the spring of 1992, 17-year-old Melissa Sanders and 19-year-old Sheila Swanson went camping with Melissa's family at a campground in Beverly Beach State Park near Newport. They fished and cooked dinner and then went to sleep, but at some point during the night, the girls decided that they did not want to stay there any longer. Without waking the others, they opened their tent and walked to a payphone to call a friend. When they were unable to find a ride, they decided that they would wait until the sun came up and hitchhike home. But they would never be seen alive again. At this time, Jon had been transferred to a new work-based location in Sweet Home because he was making all of his other coworkers uncomfortable, and this was alarming to the crew manager at this location because Jon was not a part of his team, which meant that Jon was now going to be able to move around and come and go, almost like a ghost. There was no one there to watch his movements or keep track of him. On the morning of May 3rd, 1992, the sun would have just been peeking over the horizon when Melissa and Sheila started walking down Highway 20. A short time later, a truck would pull up next to them, driven by none other than Jon Ackroyd. They recognized him thanks to meeting him at a local bar gathering place called Sherry's, where witnesses would say that any time the three of them were in this place together, Jon would abandon whatever it was he was doing and just head directly towards Melissa and Sheila. Jon would have been on his way to work when he passed the girls on Highway 20. The following timeline of my events is mostly speculation on my part because the information I have seen kind of tells one of two stories. My first theory is that Jon picked up Melissa and Sheila and drove them to a location that was very remote on Highway 20 and then threatened them. And, because they were teenagers against this big, burly, full-grown man who likely had a gun with him, they did whatever he wanted. Once to a remote location, he pulled them from the truck, raped them, and murdered them. Maybe one of them, but probably both. My other theory is supported by some more unusual experiences with Jon. When Jon would hang out at Sherry's, he was once heard stating that he had a place near Newport, and he made this comment after he heard the girls would be camping in that area. My second theory is that he saw the girls as they were walking down Highway 20, probably on purpose. When they recognized him, they were likely a little nervous, but they were also glad to see a familiar face. When they asked him for a ride home, he probably said something along the lines of, "Aw, shucks, I gotta work. But listen, let me take you to my place that's nearby. I'll pick you up when I'm off work and I'll take you home." Maybe he murdered them there, or maybe it was elsewhere. But it wasn't until he got off of work, and it was at about 9:30 p.m. when Jon finally arrived back to the station that he walked in and expected to be alone. He had blood all over his hands, his arms, and chest. It was splattered on his face and soaked through his clothes. 2 workers were there on a special shift and saw him. And when they asked him what happened, he just said, "I hit a deer and got it." But this doesn't make any sense because he didn't have a deer with him. And it was after this that the news of the 2 missing girls in the area started spreading. Not right away, though. For some reason, the parents of the girls were just not worried that they were missing and expected them to come home in about a week after running around. They didn't call the police until almost 10 days had passed. And by this time, it was too late. Their bodies were found on October 10th by hunters who were just off of Highway 20 near Eddiesville, which is about a 20-minute drive down Highway 20. And again, while Jon was strongly suspected, nothing could be proven. And maybe all of this violence could have been prevented had the police listened the first time his name was brought up. Now, maybe, just maybe, but we will never know for sure, this entire tragic line of women being attacked and murdered by Jon, it could have been prevented. And this could have happened when, on a cold day in 1977, a year before Kaye was murdered, a rape kit was performed on Marlene Gabrielson, but the police were skeptical of the rape and focused instead on the fact that she had been drinking as a minor. There were some minor inconsistencies in her story, and because of those 2 factors, they decided not to pursue the crime. So what happened to Marlene, and how is this connected to Jon? Well, in June of 1977, Marlene and her husband dropped off their baby with Marlene's mom and headed off to Sisters for a rodeo. Marlene lived along Route 20, and so Sisters was an easy place for them to get to, though it was still about an 80-mile drive. But once there, they began to drink, and she and her husband got into a fight. Marlene at this point just wanted to go home to her baby, and when her husband decided that he wasn't leaving, she started to ask around for a ride. A man overheard her and offered to take her home that night, and this man was Jon Ackroyd. As they drove and talked, Marlene learned that he had been in the Army. When he got out of the Army, he got a job as a welder, but now he worked as a highway mechanic for the state. And as they drove down the winding, lightless road, Marlene was never once bothered about the fact that the truck had no passenger handle on the inside, nor a window crank. She would be unable to open the door or window from the inside on the passenger side of this truck, and it didn't alarm her at all. Nothing, in fact, alarmed her until Jon pulled off to the side of the road. Without saying much of anything, he made his way to the passenger side, ripped open the door, grabbed Marlene by her hair, and threw her against the embankment on the side of the road. Here, he would hold a knife to her throat and threaten her, yank her pants down so hard they tore from crotch to ankles. He cut off her remaining clothing and raped her. When she tried to close her eyes and look away, he would grab her face and force her to face him, and would threaten her to make her open her eyes and look at him. Marlene at this point became so desperate just to survive so she could go home to her baby that she started to say anything and do anything to make him happy. When this was done, he gave her a dirty pair of pants, and while hesitant and clearly just wanting to get rid of her, he took her home and let her go. That we know of, Marlene is Jon's first victim. And while police just kind of ignored this, Jon did not get off completely free, as Marlene's husband then went and beat him up. Now, Highway 20 has a bit of a history with bodies and missing people. There are a few things that are potentially linked to Jon, but only by timing and circumstance. And these are, in 1976, there was a skull found just off of the highway. In 1977, the personal items of Rodney Grissom and Karen Lee were found, but they are still missing today. In 1978, a second skull was found, again just off the highway. And in 1978, also, Elizabeth Musler was found in a shallow grave. Jon either lived or worked near the location where each of these bodies or clothing were found, and Karen's pants, which were found, appeared to have been cut and torn, much in the same way that Marlene's had been torn from her body. It wouldn't be until years after Kaye's death that Jon would finally get pinned for it, and it was all thanks to his friend, the one who he had been deer hunting with, Roger Beck. Jon had even said that Roger was walking around bragging about killing Kaye, and while Jon was trying to pin the entire thing on Roger, the events that played out soon became clear. With questioning, investigators found that Roger had been telling everyone some version of the same story, which was that he had been with Jon when they passed Kaye on the road, that they stopped, abducted her, raped her, murdered her by stabbing her and then shooting her, much like Jon described when he admitted to seeing her laying on the snow that February. In 1978, Jon and Roger's alibi had been that Roger's then-wife, Pam, corroborated their story, that they had gone deer hunting. But upon their arrest in June of 1992, that changed to the truth. She was scared of Roger, and so she played along. But the truth was that Jon had come to their home at about 9 to 10 a.m. and picked up Roger to go deer hunting. But when they returned without a deer, they were both covered in blood. She burned their clothes and their brand new boots at their instruction, and then pretended not to know that anything was amiss. During the trial, it was revealed that the Fish and Wildlife Lab had evaluated Kaye's shorts and found that they had been cut off with a knife rather than torn apart by wild animals, very similar to what we know now to be Jon's calling card. They also found that her shirt had stab marks through it, and there were lead fragments indicating that she had been shot, exactly like Roger said, exactly like Jon claimed. While Jon and Roger would both be found guilty in 1993, Jon's attorneys tried to say that Jon had actually seen a different runner that day and that he had simply gotten confused and that he didn't see Kaye at all. And if he didn't see Kaye, there's no way he could have killed her. And this leads us to Jane Morris. Jane was brought into the courtroom to testify about her experience that same morning. Now, Jane was running the same morning that Kaye was abducted and murdered. She saw nothing, she heard nothing. And later that day, when she was riding her bike on her way to work at Camp Sherman's store, she noticed a man parked off the side of the road heading to Camp Sherman. And as she passed him, he stepped out from behind his truck, pointed a gun at her, and shouted for her to stop. Jane doesn't. She pedals like crazy to get away from him. He never shoots, he never follows. But his face is etched in her mind forever. And that face was that of Jon Ackroyd's. Jane Morris was the one who got away. And I hope that if you are ever in a situation that is like this, you get away too. And as we wrap up this season, my hope is that you step onto the trails and roads to do the thing that you love, that you proceed with the smarts to get you out of any of the situations we talked about alive, For there is one thing that I have learned, and that is if any of these women were still alive, they would be amazing. Kaye, in fact, could have been one of the greats during a transitional time in running for women. Instead, she is an example of why we need to use caution. But we must never relent. Never give up what brings us joy. For if we do, every single one of these monsters wins. And I refuse to see that become the truth. Thank you for listening. I hope that you are safe and happy on your adventures over the next few months and years and days and weeks. And we will talk next time. Bye. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.